Long before anyone used the phrase church decline, the sanctuary had begun to sound different. It was not about the notes. The choir still hit the harmonies, the organ still held the chords. On paper, nothing had changed. But Evelyn Price, who had stood in front of the choir loft for more than 30 years, heard the difference in the spaces between voices. Fewer bodies breathing in before a hymn, fewer shoes on the carpet, fewer murmurs when the last chord faded and the pastor stepped up to the pulpit. She counted the difference on Sunday mornings the way other people counted offering envelopes. The board did not count like that. They measured the life of the church in budget lines, program lists, and the length of the annual report. Committees still met. The thrift sale still happened. The bulletins still went to print. As long as the numbers in the treasurer's spreadsheet balanced by the end of the quarter, the board convinced itself that the congregation was fine. Evelyn knew better. She had watched entire generations pass through those wooden pews. She remembered the first time someone from the neighborhood who was not white came and stayed. She remembered when people whispered about that family at potlucks, and then, slowly, when they stopped whispering and started asking for recipes instead. She remembered when the choir was mostly older, white women in identical robes. And she remembered the day one of those women handed the lead on a gospel piece to a black teenager and clapped as the girl's voice carried the room. Music had always been the only place in that building where the rules bent first. Every year the board thanked Evelyn for her faithful service with the music ministry. They meant it. They gave her flowers once, a plaque another time, a polite round of applause at a congregational meeting. They loved what she did with the anthem, with the Christmas cantata, with the Easter sunrise harmonies. They did not ask what she thought when it came to anything else. The board was a rotating cast of retirements and elections, but a few constants remained. The chairperson had been there since before Evelyn could remember, a man whose Bible lived in a leather-zippered case, and whose faith never seemed to touch his schedule beyond Sunday morning. The treasurer watched the budget like a hawk. There were former Sunday school teachers, small business owners, one retired principal. They had grown old together, sitting in the same seats around the same polished table in the same boardroom, sharing the same narrow vision of what counted as real leadership. In that vision, Evelyn's work lived comfortably in a corner, vital but contained. She was valuable as long as she stayed with the music. Then the pews began to empty in a way they could no longer ignore. It started with the college kids, of course. They left for schools in other cities and did not return. Then, the young families started drifting to congregations with more children, bigger youth programs, livelier worship. A few of the old guard died. A few moved to retirement homes out of state. People stopped bringing friends to outreach events that no longer felt like they reached much of anything. The board saw the membership graph slope downward and did what boards do. They formed a committee. They called it the Future Vision Team. They filled it with themselves. They did not ask Evelyn to join. The Future Vision Team met every Tuesday evening for months. They printed articles about church growth. They watched videos about modern worship trends. They invited a consultant from the denominational office who talked in pleasant circles around the idea of engaging the community. They filled a whiteboard with words like renewal, strategy, outreach. They did not sit in the back pew on ordinary Sundays and listen to how thin the congregational singing had become. One night, When the consultant suggested they survey the neighborhood, someone on the board sighed and said the area had changed so much that it hardly felt like their community anymore. Evelyn's name appeared in the meeting minutes exactly twice. Once in a note that the choir continued to be a strength of our identity, and once in a suggestion, quickly tabled, that perhaps she might lead a special music event to draw people in. Life in the choir loft went on. Evelyn's world was nested in routine. Wednesday, rehearsals. Sunday warm-ups. Seasonal programs. She knew who would struggle with a tricky alto line, who needed a gentle nod to come in on time, who hid their best voice until they forgot their own self-consciousness. She watched teenagers grow into adults, leave, sometimes come back. She watched new singers arrive with tentative steps and sit down among people they had not met before, then gradually begin to greet each other in the hallways, as if they had known one another for years. The choir was the only place in the church where the demographics of the city were starting to show up. Black, white, brown, young, old, middle income, barely making it. All squeezed together on narrow wooden benches behind a single worn-out music stand. Evelyn wondered how the board could sit upstairs in its meeting room and not see that the only part of their church truly changing was the part they treated as decoration. The crisis came in numbers, because that was the only language the board fully respected. One winter, the treasurer presented a report with too many red lines. Giving had dropped. Repairs to the aging roof had cost more than expected. The heating system needed attention. Insurance kept creeping upward. The budget balance that had always worked itself out by the end of the year no longer had room to stretch. The board did what it always did at first. It shaved costs at the edges. It canceled a retreat. It extended the life of worn carpet. It delayed replacing the flickering lights in the fellowship hall. It quietly reduced hours for the custodian. None of it was enough. Then came the letter from the regional office. It was written in the neutral tone of denominational bureaucracy, but its message was blunt. The congregation's numbers had fallen below sustainable thresholds. They needed a concrete plan to stabilize and grow, or they would have to consider merging with another church, selling the property, or closing altogether. The board closed ranks around that letter like a secret. Whispers traveled anyway. People noticed the tension in the pastor's shoulders, the way board members huddled in corners after services. Rumors of closure moved faster than any official announcement could. Evelyn kept directing the choir because music did not allow pauses for panic. But she saw how anxiety changed the shape of the sound. The turning point arrived on a Sunday that began in the usual way, with coats and bulletins and the organist testing chords. The sanctuary had the thin emptiness of late winter, too many spaces between bodies. The board had decided to read the letter to the entire congregation, finally choosing honesty over silence. From her seat at the front, Evelyn watched as the pastor unfolded the paper and read. She listened as he shared the numbers, the warnings, the vague language about difficult decisions. She also watched the faces in the pews. Elderly members looked stunned, as if blindsided by a storm nobody had predicted aloud. Younger ones looked resigned, like people who had seen this coming and had already begun letting go. A few visitors shifted uncomfortably, realizing they had wandered into the middle of a crisis they did not understand. On the left side, the choir sat listening. A mix of ages and backgrounds, their reactions were complicated. Fear, anger, sadness, exhaustion. Some had been dragged through declining church stories before. Others had joined for the music without ever imagining the entire congregation might vanish. Later that day, when the choir gathered for a quick run-through of the closing hymn, the room felt different. The notes came out flat at first, as if the air itself were too heavy to carry anything. Evelyn let them stumble through the first verse. Then she stopped the pianist with a raised hand. She did not deliver a speech. She knew better than to pretend she had answers she did not. She simply reminded them, in her measured way, that as long as they were asked to sing, they would sing like the sound mattered. What she did not say out loud was that if the church truly was going to die, she refused to let it die quietly. The board scheduled an emergency meeting to respond to the letter. Predictably, they appointed yet another subcommittee. Predictably, they did not invite her. This time, however, something shifted not around the board table, but in the spaces they did not control. After service the following Sunday, a cluster of younger members and choir singers met in the fellowship hall. Some balanced coffee cups, others clutched coats. They talked not about numbers, but about what actually made them stay as long as they had. The list did not look anything like the board's agenda. They mentioned the choir again and again. They mentioned the rare Sundays when the service broke out of its rigid structure and felt alive, like the joint worship they had once done with a nearby black congregation, or the Sunday when a Latina youth group led a song in Spanish and the whole room swayed even if half the people did not know the words. They mentioned food pantry drives that had felt genuine and small group nights where people had shared stories that did not fit neatly into Sunday school answers. Evelyn listened. In that messy conversation, she heard something the board's future vision team had never managed to name. The church was not losing people because the chairs were the wrong color or the bulletin font too old-fashioned. It was losing them because the services had become a performance for the preferences of a shrinking circle instead of a gathering for the needs of the whole community. She went home, sat at her dining table, and did something she had never done in all her years as choir director. She wrote a plan. It began with music, because that was the language she trusted. A rewriting of the service that used the choir and congregational singing not as decoration, but as an invitation into something shared. Songs that drew from the Black gospel tradition and from the hymn book the older members cherished, woven together intentionally instead of set apart. Litanies that allowed more voices than the pastor's. Spaces for spontaneous testimony, carefully framed so that they did not become chaos, but did become real. Then she pushed herself beyond the choir loft. She outlined ways to draw in the people who lived within walking distance of the church, but never crossed its threshold. Partnerships with community organizations already doing the work the church claimed to care about. Open mic nights in the fellowship hall where sacred and secular art could sit in the same space without apology. Sunday meals where those with extra could sit at tables with those who had little without turning charity into a photo opportunity. She wrote about leadership changes as well, tentatively at first, then more firmly. A worship planning team that did not mirror the board's demographics. Rotating lay leaders from different age groups and backgrounds, visible commitment to becoming a truly integrated community, not just in who stood in the choir loft, but in who held microphones, keys, and clipboards. At the top of the document, she did not call it a proposal. She called it a new service and community plan, because she knew that word was the only one the board respected. For 2 days, she let the pages sit on her table while she argued with herself. The board had never asked for her input on anything outside the choir. They might ignore it. They might be offended. They might pat her on the head figuratively and file the plan in a drawer. She also knew that if she waited for them to invite her into the conversation, the church might not survive long enough to change. On the 3rd day, she printed the plan, slid it into a plain folder, and carried it up the steps to the church office. The first response was exactly what she expected. The board chair accepted the folder with polite surprise. He thanked her for sharing her thoughts. He promised the board would take it under advisement, alongside other ideas. His tone placed the plan in the same category as a suggestion for new paint colors. For several weeks, nothing happened. Attendance continued to slip. The board flirted with the idea of merging with a larger, more stable congregation across town, a church whose demographic makeup would effectively erase the fragile diversity that Evelyn's choir had cultivated. They discussed renting out the building for events as a way to bring in income. They drafted documents on closure procedures, just in case. Then, a new number appeared in the treasurer's spreadsheets, one that startled even the most resistant board members. The projected date when their reserves would run out if giving continued at its current rate. It was not decades away. It was measured in months. Panic sharpened their vision. The regional office followed its previous letter with a visit. A representative sat at their board table and asked pointed questions about what concrete steps they had taken to address decline. When the board answered with vague language about committees and conversations, the representative pushed harder. The choices were laid out starkly. Develop a credible plan for transformation, commit to it visibly, or prepare to close or merge. Under that pressure, someone remembered the folder. It surfaced at the next meeting in a small stack of papers. The chair admitted, with an awkward cough, that they had received a plan from the choir director some weeks back and had not yet reviewed it thoroughly. The moment was revealing. They'd been so accustomed to treating her work as background that her attempt to reshape the foreground had barely registered. They read. What struck them first was not the creativity, but the clarity. The plan tied every change in worship to an outcome the regional representative had just told them to care about: participation, engagement, visible integration, community presence. It used language they understood: attendance, connection, measurable steps, bridged with language they usually dismissed, like joy, testimony, shared ownership. Several members of the board felt a quiet wave of shame. They had spent months circling the same talking points, while the woman they had relegated to music had quietly mapped out a more concrete path than any of them. They did not suddenly transform into visionaries. But fear is a strange ally. It loosened their grip on the old patterns just enough. At the following meeting, the question shifted from whether to use the plan to how much of it they would risk. In the end, it was the regional representative who forced their hand. The office wanted something tangible to justify continued support. The representative asked who in the congregation seemed most connected to the people still showing up and the people they wanted to reach. The board answered honestly, perhaps for the first time, the choir director. What followed was another kind of meeting entirely. For the first time in 3 decades, Evelyn sat at the board table not as background support, but as the person everyone in the room needed. They did not suddenly erase their patterns. Some still spoke over her at first, or translated her ideas into their own safer language. But the basic fact had changed. The church's survival now visibly depended on what she knew. She brought a copy of her plan and laid it on the table, not as a petition, but as a framework. She answered questions about logistics, about how to keep older members from feeling alienated, about how to bring in new people without turning worship into a show. She insisted on building a worship planning team that truly reflected the diversity they claimed to want. She named people by name: teenagers from the choir, middle-aged parents, older members who had quietly welcomed change for years. There was resistance. There were mutters about tradition. There were uneasy jokes about the church becoming something else. Evelyn did not argue those points with anger. She simply pointed to the white space in the pews and the date in the treasurer's projection and asked in her measured tone what they preferred: a smaller version of what had already failed, or a different shape that might open doors. Slowly, painfully, the board voted through the changes. The new service did not arrive overnight as a spectacle. It began with one Sunday designated as a trial, a combined effort between the existing congregation and a few partner groups Evelyn had already spoken to quietly. The choir expanded for that day, drawing in singers from neighboring churches. The order of worship shifted. More time for singing, less time for announcements, a testimony from someone who did not fit the usual mold. That first experimental service felt messy. The sound system misbehaved. A hymn ran long when the congregation kept singing. An older member looked visibly uncomfortable during a gospel number and then, to everyone's surprise, began clapping on the offbeat by the third verse. A young woman from down the street slipped in late, drawn by the music she heard through the open doors, and stayed through the benediction. The board watched from their reserved seats, faces tight. The regional representative, present in the back pew, watched something else entirely. People who had not spoken to each other in months greeting one another after the service with a kind of tentative excitement. A teenager asking when they could do something like this again. An older woman wiping tears from her eyes and saying that, for the first time in a long time, the church had felt alive. The board could not argue with that. Evelyn refused to let the new service become a one-time event. She knew how institutions worked. They were always tempted to try something once and then retreat to the familiar. She pushed for a schedule. Once a month at first, then twice, then every week. She insisted that if they wanted to become an integrated community, it could not be a seasonal experiment. It had to be their normal. Over months, the shape of the congregation began to change. Some longtime members quietly slipped away, unhappy with the new direction. They found other churches where things looked and sounded more like their memories. It hurt, but it was not unexpected. Other people arrived. Neighbors who had lived within sight of the steeple for years finally stepped inside. Young adults who had written off church as either too political or too hollow found something that felt honest and rooted. Families from different backgrounds discovered that their children learned each other's names in the fellowship hall. The choir loft filled out again, then spilled beyond its old boundaries. The board meetings changed as well. It did not happen in a single election, but over a few years, the faces around the table shifted. Some of the old guard aged out and finally stepped aside. New board members from the choir, from the neighborhood, from different racial and economic backgrounds, took seats they had never been invited to occupy before. The agenda slowly moved away from maintenance and toward mission. Through it all, Evelyn kept directing. She still cued entries and balanced harmonies, still marked up sheet music and scheduled rehearsals. But her role had stretched far past the conductor's stand. She became the quiet center of a network of relationships that held the congregation together, between old and new, between Sunday and weekday, between what had been and what might be. Years later, visitors who walked into the church for the first time often assumed she was the senior pastor. In a way, they were not wrong. Titles on paper told one story. Influence in the room told another. The people who had once kept her at the music eventually found themselves attending services designed in large part by the woman they had treated as support staff. They sat in pews and sang songs chosen by a worship team she had gathered. They watched children from multiple cultures lead readings. They approved budgets that included line items for initiatives she had birthed. They did this not because they had become entirely different people, but because decline had forced them to face a truth Evelyn had carried all along. A church that refuses to listen to the people most connected to the living community eventually ends up preaching to empty chairs. On a quiet afternoon, long after the regional office had stopped sending warning letters and started using the congregation as an example of what renewal could look like, Evelyn stood alone in the sanctuary. The light coming through the stained glass cast patches of color on the floor. The room no longer felt thin. Even in silence, it carried a residue of voices. She walked slowly down the center aisle and paused halfway, turning to look at the choir loft, at the stretch of pews, at the balcony where teenagers liked to sit. She remembered the board years when her advice had been considered relevant only if it came in 4/4 time. She remembered the first service under the new plan, the fear, the rough edges. She also remembered the moment a child of mixed heritage had run up to her after a service and said that this church felt like home. That memory, more than any graph or report, told her what had changed. The building was the same. The cross at the front had not moved. The organ pipes still framed the back wall, but the community inside had turned slowly and painfully toward something truer than its old habits. The board had once ignored the woman who knew the congregation's heartbeat better than anyone. When the pews began to empty, they had reached for her out of desperation. In doing so, they had handed the future of their church to the person who had been quietly holding its soul in her hands for decades. She had not saved the congregation alone. No one person can do that. But she had refused to let its story end as a slow fade out, overseen by people who mistook their own comfort for the will of God. Instead, she had helped it modulate into a new key, one that could hold more voices. In the end, the church did not become the place the board had always wanted. It became, finally, the place its people needed. And for the first time, the name on the program under the word leadership meant what it should have meant all along when it listed the director of music. Not someone kept politely in the background, but someone who had quietly become the architect of the whole song.